Welcome back to Daily Dose of Hebrew. We're in the weekend editions here, still working through 1 Samuel 3. Today we're going to be looking at the grammar and syntax of verse 5. Today we're going to cover just the translation and morphology aspect, and then next week we will look at the accent. So this is part 1 of 1 Samuel 3:5. So let's read the Hebrew together, and then we'll look at the overall translation first. Let's read this together. Vayarotz el Eli. Vayomer hinni ki karata li. Vayomer lo karati shuv shechav. Vayelech vayishkav. Verse 5 tells us of Samuel's thought that Eli was calling him rather than the Lord. The verse translates as a whole like this. And then he ran to Eli, and he said, Behold, I, or again like last week, here I am, for you called to me. And he said, Eli now is the subject. There's nothing inherent here in the grammar that shows us that Eli is the subject, but the context would tell us this. And he said, I did not call. Return. Lie down. And then he went, switching back to Samuel again as the subject, and he went and he laid down. The verb at the beginning here is the call imperfect 3ms of the root roots, to run, resh, vav, tzade. With the vav consecutive, it continues the narrative in temporal succession here. Samuel heard the call in the previous verse, and then, temporally, he ran to Eli. The theme vowel in vayarots is a kametz hatuf. You may have heard that in the pronunciation. The root roots, that's difficult to say, is a hollow verb, or it may be what some call an R2 vav, and the theme vowel in the imperfect is a shurik. And when the vav consecutive retracts the accent, the shurik is then left in a closed and unaccented syllable. And it's odd to see a historic long vowel reduce, but it does in this case, and it reduces to a holum, which is in the OU vowel class. So we have here vayarots. The next clause has the call imperfect 3ms of amar plus a vav consecutive, followed then by Samuel's direct speech, behold me, or here I am. As in last week's verse, this is the particle hene, behold, along with the 1cs suffix. The next clause is a ground clause, or what we may call a reason clause. Samuel is explaining the ground or the reason for why he has run to Eli. Ki begins the clause as for, and it's attached to the call perfect 2ms of kara, to call. Here, lamed marks the direct object, you called me. But it also could be translated as you called to me, more literally, and it still means something very similar. Notice some of the anomalies of karata. It looks like maybe a vowel pointing is missing under the aleph. Our normal call perfect paradigm form that we learned is something like this, katalta, katalta. In the root kara, the R3 aleph would have a silent schwa if we use this standard pointing of our standard paradigm. Remember that alephs in silent schwa positions will often quiesce and lengthen the preceding vowel by compensation. So that's how we get the long kametz as the theme vowel here. Next, I want you to notice there's no dagesh lene in the tav sufformative of the perfect 2ms. And this is because when the aleph quiesces, the silent schwa is also gone, and the tav, being a bigad kefat letter, is no longer preceded by the absence of sound. So hence here it's going to lose its dagesh lene. The next verbal clause shifts the subject to Eli with the call imperfect 3ms of amar plus a vav consecutive. This is the same form as we saw earlier in this verse of of amar. And then he said, the direct speech begins here with the negation, and it is constructed onto the call perfect 1cs of kara. Now, the same vowel structure is consistent here with kara as we had earlier in the verse, but we have here the 1cs sufformative t rather than the 2ms sufformative ta, as we saw before. The next two verbs are quick and maybe somewhat terse in the speech. Perhaps Eli is frustrated that Samuel keeps waking him up with what initially seems to be silliness or maybe, quote, hearing things in the night. Shuv here is the call imperative to ms of shin vav bait, and it means return. The next verb is also the call imperative to ms, this time of the root shin kaf bait, to lie down. So Eli says to Samuel, I did not call, return, lie down. The final clause here is the summation or the conclusion of this initial conversation between Eli and Samuel. Both verbs are call imperfect 3ms verbs plus vav consecutives. The first root is halach, he lamed kaf, and the second is shakav, shin kaf bait. Remember that halach behaves as if there was a yod in the first root letter position. So we get here lengthening of the preformative vowel from a heroic to sere in the EI vowel class. The accent retracts, and the final syllable is closed and unaccented. It leaves a segol then, rather than a sere in the thematic vowel position. Vayishkav is a standard call imperfect form. It looks great, but does have an A thematic vowel that has lengthened to a kametz, this time due to a heavy disjunctive accent, the saluk right here. This is what we call a pausal form, and pausal forms will often lengthen a short vowel in this case, or it'll reveal the original vowel of a vocal schwa that has reduced. Again, in this case, in this instance of the pausal form, we have the lengthening of a vowel. So that covers a good portion of the morphology and translation here. Next week, we'll cover the accents in 1 Samuel 3:5. I want to thank you again for joining us today, and until next time, shalom.